What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about second chances, about the brutal way society judges women who dare to dream past their supposed expiration date, and about the extraordinary power of one man's courage to change a woman's entire world. This isn't just another tale from the Wild West. This is the story that will make you question every assumption you've ever had about love, worth, and the lie that tells women their value diminishes with each passing year. Picture this: the dusty town of Millbrook, Texas, 1887, where a woman's worth was measured not by her intelligence, her strength, or her character, but by one cruel calculation: how many childbearing years she had left. But what happened on the steps of Millbrook's only church on a scorching August morning will stop your heart cold. A 45-year-old woman, stripped of her dignity in front of the entire town, faced the most humiliating moment of her life when the man she traveled across 3 states to marry took one look at her and declared her past her usefulness. The crowd's laughter was still echoing across the dusty square when a stranger stepped out of the shadows. A man whose quiet words would shatter every cruel assumption about age and beauty and worth. How did one moment of devastating rejection become the beginning of the most beautiful love story the frontier had ever witnessed? How does a woman who'd been told she was too old, too plain, too late, discover that sometimes the greatest love comes to those who've learned the true meaning of patience and grace? Stay with me, because this story of Catherine Winters will tear your heart apart and rebuild it stronger than before. You'll witness the moment when cruelty met courage, when prejudice faced love, and when one cowboy's simple act of recognition changed not just one woman's life, but an entire town's understanding of what makes a person truly valuable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we reach that life-changing confrontation, before we see how one man's respect could heal years of society's rejection, let me take you back to the beginning. Back to the small boarding house room where Catherine Winters stood before a cracked mirror, preparing for what she hoped would be the last day she'd ever wake up alone. This is her story. This is how love found a woman who'd been told she was past finding. This is how the frontier taught an entire town that sometimes the most precious things are the ones the world tries to convince you are worthless. Are you ready to have your heart both broken and healed? Because once we step into Catherine's world, there's no going back. The mirror in Catherine Winters' cramped boarding house room told the truth with merciless clarity. 45 years of hard living had left their mark. The face staring back at her was weathered by prairie winds and lined by sorrows that ran deeper than skin. But it was an honest face, and Catherine had learned long ago that honesty was often the only luxury she could afford. She stood in her best dress, a practical navy blue wool that had seen better years but was clean and carefully mended, and tried to summon the courage that had carried her across 3 states to reach this moment. Her hands, calloused from years of work but steady as surgeon's tools, smoothed the fabric one final time. Today was supposed to be her wedding day. Today, at 45, she was finally going to become someone's wife. The boarding house room was sparse, containing little more than a narrow bed, a washstand with a chip basin, and the small trunk that held everything she owned in the world. But Catherine had lived with less, much less. The daughter of a blacksmith who died when she was 16, she'd spent nearly 30 years keeping house for her invalid brother, nursing him through the consumption that had slowly stolen his strength and finally his life 2 years ago. 2 years of freedom, 2 years of working as a hotel cook in various frontier towns, saving every penny, dreaming of something more than solitude and service. When Henry Lawson's letter had arrived in response to her carefully worded advertisement in the matrimonial section of the Texas Pioneer, Catherine had dared to believe that her patient waiting was finally over. Respected lady, 45, seeks companionship in marriage. Excellent cook, experienced housekeeper, of sound health and moral character. No longer young, but possesses wisdom and gentle spirit. Honest correspondence welcomed. Henry's reply had been everything she'd hoped for: respectful, practical, honest about his own circumstances as a 52-year-old widower with a small general store in Millbrook. Their correspondence over 6 months had revealed a man of apparent substance and kindness, someone who appreciated her forthright manner and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on everything, from politics to poetry. Dear Miss Winters, his last letter had read, I have made arrangements for our wedding ceremony at the community church this coming Saturday at 10 o'clock. Reverend Mitchell has agreed to officiate, and I have taken the liberty of informing several prominent citizens who have expressed interest in welcoming you to our community. I await your arrival with great anticipation. Catherine had spent her last savings on the train ticket to Millbrook, plus a small bouquet of silk flowers and a thin gold band that would serve as her wedding ring. It wasn't much, but it was everything she had, and it represented hope. Something she'd learned to portion out carefully over the years, like medicine that might lose its potency if used too freely. The church bells of Millbrook were chiming 9:30 when Catherine stepped onto Main Street, her small valise in one hand and her bouquet in the other. The town was larger than she'd expected, with two-story buildings lining the main thoroughfare and wooden sidewalks that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Morning sunshine painted everything golden, and for a moment, Catherine allowed herself to imagine walking these streets as Mrs. Henry Lawson, belonging somewhere, being part of something larger than her own survival. But as she made her way toward the white steepled church at the end of the street, she began to notice the stairs. Not the casual curiosity that might greet any stranger in a small town, but something more pointed, more judgmental. Conversation stopped as she passed, and she caught fragments of whispered commentary that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. That must be her. 45 years old, can you imagine? Poor Henry, what was he thinking? Someone should have warned him. Catherine kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, but each whisper felt like a small cut. She'd faced this kind of scrutiny before, in every town where she'd tried to make a life for herself. A woman of her age traveling alone, seeking marriage, was apparently an object of fascination and pity in equal measure. The community church stood at the intersection of Main and Cedar Streets, its white clapboard walls and tall steeple a beacon of respectability. A small crowd had gathered on the front steps, more people than Catherine had expected for a simple wedding between two middle-aged strangers. She recognized none of them, but their faces wore the expression she'd learned to dread. The morbid curiosity of people watching someone else's private business become public entertainment. Henry Lawson waited near the church door, exactly as he'd described himself in his letters. A man of medium height with thinning brown hair and a neat mustache, dressed in a good black suit. But something was wrong. Catherine could see it in his posture before she was close enough to read his expression. He stood rigid, his shoulders hunched as if bracing against a blow, and his eyes darted nervously between Catherine and the assembled crowd. Mr. Lawson, Catherine said quietly as she approached, offering him her warmest smile despite the ice forming in her stomach. I hope I'm not late. Henry jumped as if her voice had startled him from a trance. Catherine, Miss Winters, that is... He seemed to struggle with her name, as if he'd forgotten it entirely. You're here. As we arranged, Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her head. Shall we go inside? I believe Reverend Mitchell is expecting us. Henry's face had gone pale and a sheen of perspiration beaded his upper lip despite the pleasant morning temperature. About today, about our arrangement. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his forehead. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow, but she'd had too much practice hiding pain to let it show on her face. What kind of misunderstanding, Mr. Lawson? You see, Henry's voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat before continuing. In your letters, you described yourself as, well, as mature. But I wasn't expecting... He gestured vaguely in her direction, his movements awkward and desperate. You're older than I imagined. Considerably older. The crowd had grown silent, sensing drama in the air like vultures circling wounded prey. Catherine felt every eye upon her, felt the weight of their curiosity and judgment pressing down like a physical force. But years of disappointment had taught her to maintain her dignity, even when the world seemed determined to strip it away. I stated my age clearly in my advertisement, Mr. Lawson, Catherine said, her voice carrying despite its quietness. 45 years. I was honest about my circumstances. Yes, but Henry's confidence seemed to grow as he found his rhythm, as if he were warming to a rehearsed speech. Honesty about numbers is one thing. The reality is quite another. That is to say, he paused, gathering courage for what came next. You're past your usefulness as a wife. The words fell into the morning air like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shocked whispers and barely suppressed laughter. Catherine felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up her neck, but this time it was worse than ever before. This wasn't just private rejection. This was public judgment delivered in front of an audience that had come expecting to witness a wedding and instead found themselves watching her dreams crumble in real time. My usefulness, Catherine repeated quietly, tasting the bitterness of the words. A man marries for certain purposes, Henry continued, his voice gaining strength now that his decision was made. To build a family to ensure the continuation of his line, a woman of your advanced years cannot fulfill those basic requirements of matrimony. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, stepped forward from the crowd, her face a mask of false sympathy. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Surely you must have known this day would come. A woman your age still chasing after marriage like a schoolgirl. It's really quite unseemly." Another voice joined the chorus of judgment. "There's a time for everything, and yours has clearly passed." 45 years old and still trying to catch a husband, came a third voice, followed by the kind of nervous laughter that people use to distance themselves from uncomfortable truths. Some women just don't know when to accept their lot. Catherine felt the walls of her carefully constructed hope crumbling around her. Every whisper was a nail in the coffin of her dreams, every sideways glance, a reminder that society had written her off as irrelevant, past her expiration date, too old to matter. "Perhaps," Henry said, his tone suggesting he was doing her a great favor, "you might consider returning to wherever you came from. I'm sure there are opportunities for a woman of your domestic skills. Housekeeping positions, perhaps, caring for elderly relatives, something more appropriate for someone in your circumstances." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Catherine looked around at the faces surrounding her, some openly hostile, others merely curious. All of them convinced that they were witnessing the natural order of things. A woman who had waited too long, hoped too much, reached too high was being put firmly back in her place. For a moment, Catherine's resolve wavered. The practical part of her mind whispered that Henry was right, that Mrs. Abernathy was right, that all of them were right. She was 45 years old, no longer young, no longer capable of bearing children. Perhaps she should have accepted her spinster status years ago, instead of nurturing impossible dreams of love and companionship. But then something inside her, something that had survived 30 years of thankless service and 2 years of solitary struggle, rebelled against their collective judgment. "Mr. Lawson," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd with surprising strength, "you corresponded with me for 6 months. You know my mind, my character, my capabilities. You know I'm educated, responsible, and capable of managing a household. But none of that matters to you, does it? Because my worth as a woman is apparently measured solely by my womb." Henry's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, clearly unprepared for this response. Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You're right about one thing. I cannot guarantee you children, but neither can many women half my age. What I can guarantee is loyalty, intelligence, companionship, and the kind of partnership that comes from experience and wisdom rather than youthful infatuation." She turned to address the crowd directly, her chin lifted with a dignity that no amount of rejection could truly destroy. "And as for the rest of you, thank you for the reminder that a woman's value is apparently measured only by her fertility and not by her heart, her mind, or her soul." The church steps fell silent except for the sound of wind through the cottonwood trees that lined the street. Catherine gathered her skirts, preparing to walk away with whatever dignity she could salvage, when a voice cut through the stillness like thunder rolling across the prairie. "Ma'am, before you go, I was wondering if you might consider a different proposition." Every head turned toward the source of the voice as if pulled by invisible strings. At the back of the crowd, a man stepped forward, tall and lean with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of facing down challenges and emerging victorious. He wore simple clothes, dark denim pants, a white cotton shirt, and a black hat that had seen honest wear. But it wasn't his clothes that commanded attention. It was the way he moved, with purpose and authority, that made the crowd instinctively part to create a clear path. Catherine had never seen him before in her life, but something about his direct gaze and respectful bearing made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Excuse me?" Henry sputtered, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "Who are you? What gives you the right to interfere in this matter?" The stranger reached the bottom of the church steps and paused, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and subtly mocking. "Name's Jake Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "And I wasn't interfering, friend. I was making an offer." His eyes found Catherine's and held them steadily. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but overhear this conversation. And I have to say, any man who'd reject a woman of obvious intelligence and character because of something as meaningless as age is making the biggest mistake of his life." Henry's face flushed red. "This is a private matter." "Was a private matter," Jake corrected quietly. "Now it's a public humiliation, and I don't much care for the way it's being conducted." He stepped closer to Catherine, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to his clothes. "Ma'am, I know this is presumptuous, but I was wondering, would you consider marrying me instead?" The question hit the crowd like a lightning strike. Voices exploded in shocked exclamations, but Catherine heard none of them clearly. The world had narrowed to Jake Sullivan's steady brown eyes and the impossible words he'd just spoken. I don't understand," Catherine managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Jake replied simply. "I know you're brave enough to travel across 3 states to start a new life. I know you're honest enough to state your age plainly instead of lying about it. I know you're strong enough to face down a crowd of people determined to tear you down. And I know you deserves a hell of a lot better than what you're getting here today." Mrs. Abernathy pushed forward, her face twisted with indignation. "This is scandalous. You can't just... You don't know anything about this woman." Jake's gaze shifted to her, and his expression grew cold. "I know she's been treated with disrespect by people who should know better. I know she's shown more grace under pressure than anyone else here today. And I know that if these are the kind of people who call themselves her betters, then she's clearly superior company." His attention returned to Catherine, and his voice gentled. "Ma'am, I own a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. It's not much. A modest house, some cattle, enough land to make a living. I'm not rich, but I'm solvent. I don't drink to excess, I don't gamble, and I've never raised a hand to anyone who didn't deserve it." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I can't promise you passion or poetry or the kind of romantic love that young people think they need, but I can promise you respect, partnership, and the chance to build something meaningful together. If you're willing to take a chance on a stranger who's apparently crazy enough to propose marriage in front of half the town." Catherine stared at him, searching his face for signs of mockery or pity, or the kind of desperation that might drive a man to marry anyone just to have a wife. She found none of those things. Instead, she saw something she'd almost given up believing existed: genuine respect, honest appreciation, and what might have been the beginning of real affection. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this for someone you don't know?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his eyes never leaving her face. "Because I've spent too many years watching good people settle for less than they deserve because they're afraid to take a chance. Because I've seen what loneliness can do to a person, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And because in the past 10 minutes, you've shown me more courage and dignity than most people manage in a lifetime." He gestured toward Henry and the judgmental crowd. "These folks want to measure your worth by things that don't matter. Age, childbearing potential, what other people think. But I'd rather measure it by things that do matter: character, intelligence, strength, grace under pressure." His voice grew stronger, carrying clearly across the church steps. And by those measures, ma'am, you're the most valuable person here today? The words hit Catherine like a physical force, bringing tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with recognition. For the first time in her 45 years, someone was seeing her, truly seeing her. Not as a burden or a charity case or a woman past her prime, but as a person of worth. Mr. Sullivan, she said quietly, testing his name on her tongue. I don't know what to say. Say yes, he replied simply. Say you'll give an honest man a chance to show you what real appreciation looks like. Catherine looked around at the crowd, at Henry's flabbergasted expression, at Mrs. Abernathy's shocked face, at the mixture of scandal and curiosity painted across a dozen different features. These people had spent the morning telling her she was too old, too late, too hopeful for her own good. They'd made her humiliation into their entertainment, her pain into their gossip. But this stranger, this Jake Sullivan, was offering her something entirely different. Not charity, not pity, but partnership. Not tolerance, but respect. Not someone willing to settle for her, but someone who saw her as a prize worth winning. The practical voice in her head screamed warnings about the foolishness of marrying a complete stranger, about the risks and uncertainties and potential for disaster. But the part of her that had survived decades of disappointment and emerged with hope intact whispered something different. What if this time is different? What if this is exactly what you've been waiting for? Catherine looked into Jake Sullivan's steady brown eyes and made the most important decision of her life. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with certainty. Yes, I'll marry you. The eruption of shocked voices that followed Catherine's acceptance was like a dam bursting, a flood of scandal, disbelief, and moral outrage that threatened to sweep away what little dignity remained of the morning's proceedings. But Catherine found herself surprisingly unmoved by the chaos swirling around her. For the first time in years, she felt anchored by something stronger than other people's opinions. The steady presence of Jake Sullivan beside her, and the quiet certainty that she had just chosen courage over convention. This is madness! Henry Lawson's voice cracked as he pushed forward, his face red with indignation. You can't possibly be serious about marrying a complete stranger? More serious than I was about marrying you, Catherine replied with a calmness that surprised even her. At least Mr. Sullivan has shown me more respect in 10 minutes than you managed in 6 months of correspondence. Mrs. Abernathy clutched her husband's arm as if witnessing a natural disaster. Reverend Mitchell, surely you can't allow this spectacle to continue. There are proper procedures, bans to be published, character references to be checked. Reverend Mitchell, a portly man with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who'd performed his pastoral duties through every conceivable human crisis, stepped forward from where he'd been observing the proceedings with growing concern. Mrs. Abernathy raises valid points, he said gently. While I appreciate the unconventional nature of this situation, marriage is a sacred institution that requires careful consideration. Jake touched the brim of his hat respectfully. Reverend, I understand your concerns, but if I may point out, Miss Winters here was prepared to marry Mr. Lawson after knowing him only through letters. She's shown considerable faith in a man she'd never met face to face. I'm simply asking for the same consideration. But we don't know anything about you, another voice called from the crowd. You could be anyone, a criminal, a drifter, a man with a dozen wives scattered across the territory. Jake's expression remained calm, but Catherine caught a glint of steel in his eyes. Could be, he agreed easily, just like your banker could be embezzling money, or your mayor could be taking bribes, or your preacher could be skimming from the collection plate. People aren't always what they seem, but sometimes they're exactly what they appear to be. He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. I'm a rancher, folks. I own the Sullivan spread 10 miles north of here. 200 acres of good grazing land, a house I built with my own hands, and cattle that bear my brand. I've lived in this territory for 8 years, paid my taxes on time, and never given anyone cause for complaint. Then why hasn't anyone heard of you? Mrs. Abernathy demanded suspiciously. Because I mind my own business and stay out of town gossip, Jake replied with a slight smile. Something that might benefit more people around here. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a lean man with graying temples who'd been watching the proceedings from the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. I know Jake Sullivan, he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of speculation. Known him for 5 years, ever since he helped track down the cattle rustlers who were hitting ranches south of here. He's exactly what he says he is, a decent man who keeps his word and pays his debts. The sheriff's endorsement seemed to deflate some of the crowd's outrage, but Henry wasn't finished. Even if he is who he claims to be, this whole situation is irregular, inappropriate. A woman of her circumstances shouldn't be making such hasty decisions. Her circumstances? Jake's voice had gone dangerously quiet. You mean the circumstances of being an intelligent, capable woman who's been treated poorly by someone who doesn't deserve her? He stepped closer to Henry, and the smaller man instinctively backed away. Friend, you had your chance, and you threw it away. Now step aside and let people who know real value when they see it take over. Catherine felt a warmth spreading through her chest. Not the desperate hope she'd carried to Millbrook, but something steadier and more sustaining. She was watching a man defend her worth without being asked, standing up to a crowd's judgment without flinching, treating her like someone precious rather than someone pitied. Mr. Sullivan, she said quietly, and the quality of her voice made everyone fall silent. Are you certain about this? I mean truly certain? Because I've learned that marriage proposals made in the heat of the moment often look very different in the cold light of dawn. Jake turned to face her fully, and Catherine felt the impact of his complete attention like sunlight after a long winter. Ma'am, I've been alone for most of my adult life by choice, not circumstance. I could have married a dozen times over the years if I'd wanted to settle for someone who merely suited my convenience. The fact that I'm standing here now, in front of half the town, asking you to take a chance on me, that should tell you something about how certain I am. He paused, his gaze never wavering from hers. I'm not a young man full of romantic notions, Miss Winters. I'm 38 years old, and I know the difference between infatuation and recognition. What I recognize in you is worth, character, and the kind of strength that only comes from facing life's challenges with grace. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to call you my wife. Reverend Mitchell cleared his throat. If you're both truly committed to this course of action, I suppose, that is, if you're prepared to exchange vows. We are, Jake said firmly. Catherine felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Yes, we are. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Catherine had ever imagined for herself. As a girl, she'd dreamed of white lace and orange blossoms, of a church filled with friends and family, of a man who looked at her with adoration born of long courtship. Reality was a practical navy dress, wildflowers that Henry had brought but Jake now offered to her, and a groom who looked at her with something that might have been respect but was still too new to be called love. But as Jake took her hand and spoke his vows in a voice steady and sure, Catherine felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt chosen, not settled for, not tolerated, not accepted despite her flaws, but deliberately and completely chosen. Do you, Catherine Winters, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Catherine looked into Jake's brown eyes and saw her future reflected there. Uncertain, perhaps, but full of possibility. I do. Do you, Jake Sullivan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do, Jake said, and Catherine heard something in his voice that made her believe he meant it completely. When Reverend Mitchell pronounced them husband and wife, Jake leaned forward and kissed her gently on the forehead, a gesture so tender and respectful that Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes for the second time that morning. Mrs. Sullivan, he said softly, testing the name. Mrs. Sullivan, Catherine repeated, and the name felt like a gift she'd never expected to receive. As they turned to face the crowd, Catherine saw a mixture of expressions that ranged from shock to disapproval to something that might have been grudging admiration. A few people were already drifting away, as if the unexpected turn of events had robbed the morning of its entertainment value. But others pressed closer, drawn by curiosity about what would happen next. Henry Lawson stood frozen in place, his face a study in outraged disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he announced to anyone who would listen. "She'll regret this within a week. Mark my words, she'll come crawling back when she realizes what kind of man she's actually married." Jake paused in helping Catherine gather her small bouquet and valise. "Lawson," he said conversationally, "I'd suggest you stop talking now. You've already made enough of a fool of yourself for one day. You can't just steal another man's bride." "I didn't steal anything," Jake replied calmly. "You threw her away. I just had sense enough to pick her up." As they walked away from the church toward a simple wagon that waited on Main Street, Catherine felt the strange sensation of her life splitting into before and after. Before, when she'd been Catherine Winters, the spinster, the caretaker, the woman who'd waited too long and hoped too much. And after, when she'd become Catherine Sullivan, the woman worth fighting for. "Jake," she said as they reached the wagon, "why did you really do that? Why did you marry a woman you don't even know?" He was quiet for a moment, helping her up onto the wagon seat before answering. "My sister died when she was 38, he said finally, settling beside her and taking up the reins. "Unmarried because every man in her town decided she was too old, too independent, too set in her ways to make a good wife." Catherine waited, sensing there was more to this story. "She was the strongest, wisest, most beautiful woman I ever knew," Jake continued, guiding the horses away from town. "She could outride most men, outshoot half of them, and could run a ranch better than anyone I've ever seen. But she died alone because she'd been convinced that her worth was tied to other people's narrow-minded opinions about what made a woman valuable." He glanced at Catherine, his expression serious. "When I saw that fool rejecting you, when I heard those people talking about you like you were some kind of burden instead of a prize, I saw him throwing away what my sister never had the chance to find. Someone who could recognize her true worth." "And you think I'm like your sister?" Jake considered this carefully. "I think you're a woman who's been undervalued for far too long. I think you've got more strength and grace than any of those people back there deserve to witness. And I think that if you'll give me a chance, I might just be lucky enough to discover all the ways I was right." As they drove through the countryside toward Jake's ranch, Catherine found herself studying her new husband's profile. He had strong features weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, and he sat with the relaxed confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Are you worried?" he asked, apparently noticing her scrutiny. "Terrified," Catherine admitted. "I've never been married. I don't know how to be a wife to someone like you." "Someone like me. Someone kind," she said softly. "Someone who sees good in me when other people see only problems. I'm not used to that." Jake pulled the wagon to a stop beside a creek that ran clear and cold between stands of cottonwood trees. "Catherine," he said, turning to face her fully, "I need you to understand something important." He took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "I didn't marry you out of pity or charity or some misguided sense of chivalry. I married you because in the space of 15 minutes, you showed me more courage and dignity than most people manage in a lifetime." His thumbs brushed over her knuckles. "You stood there and took that man's cruelty with grace. You were prepared to walk away with your head high, even when everyone was watching and judging. You defended yourself with intelligence and strength instead of dissolving into tears or anger." Catherine felt her breath catching in her throat. "That's not someone who needs to be rescued," Jake continued. "That's someone worth knowing, worth respecting, worth learning to love, if you'll let me try." The word love hung in the air between them, carrying weight and promise and terrifying possibility. "I don't know how to let someone try," Catherine whispered. "Then we'll figure it out together," Jake said simply. "Day by day, mistake by mistake, until we get it right." As the wagon rolled onward toward her new life, Catherine marveled at the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. 12 hours ago, she'd been a spinster traveling to marry a man who saw her as adequate. Now she was Mrs. Jake Sullivan, wife to a man who seemed to see her as remarkable. It was too much to process, too overwhelming to fully accept. But as the afternoon sun painted the prairie grass gold and Jake hummed softly beside her, Catherine allowed herself to hope that perhaps, at 45, her real life was just beginning. The Sullivan Ranch appeared in the distance like something from a dream Catherine had never dared to have. Nestled in a valley between gently rolling hills, the property stretched out in all directions, fields dotted with cattle, pastures enclosed by neat fencing, and at the center of it all, a house that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. "It's beautiful," Catherine breathed, and she meant it completely. The house was larger than she'd expected, built of sturdy timber with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Windows caught the afternoon light like welcoming eyes, and smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line against the clear blue sky. Everything about the place spoke of care and permanence, the kind of home that was built to last generations. "It'll do," Jake replied, but Catherine could hear the pride in his voice. "Built most of it myself over the past 8 years. Started with just a cabin and added on as I could afford it." As they approached the main house, Catherine noticed other buildings scattered across the property. A large barn that looked recently painted, a chicken coop where birds scratched contentedly in the dirt, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be a workshop with tools hanging neatly on the walls. "How much land do you have?" Catherine asked, awed by the scope of what she was seeing. 200 acres, Jake said, bringing the wagon to a stop near the front porch. "Most of it's grazing land, but I've got 40 acres in crops, corn, wheat, some vegetables. The creek runs year-round, so water's never been a problem." He climbed down from the wagon and came around to help Catherine descend. His hands were gentle but sure as he lifted her down, and Catherine felt a flutter of something that might have been attraction mixed with nervous anticipation. "Come on," Jake said, gathering her trunk and valise. "Let me show you around." The interior of the house was a revelation. Catherine had expected the sparse functionality of a bachelor's dwelling, but what she found instead was a home that spoke of thoughtful planning and careful craftsmanship. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and furniture that was obviously handmade but well-crafted. Windows on three sides filled the space with natural light, and everything was clean and orderly. "The kitchen's through here," Jake said, leading her into a room that made Catherine's heart sing. A proper cook stove dominated one wall, with copper pots hanging from hooks and shelves lined with dishes and supplies. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, scarred from use but well-maintained, and windows looked out over the vegetable garden. "It's wonderful," Catherine said, running her hands over the smooth surface of the table. "You built all of this?" "Most of it. Had some help with the heavy timber work, but the finished carpentry's mine." Jake set her belongings down and watched her explore the space. "The bedroom's upstairs. I figured you'd want the larger room. I can take the smaller one down here." Catherine paused in her examination of the kitchen shelves. "You don't expect us to... That is, you're not planning for us to share." "Not until you're ready," Jake said firmly. "We're strangers who made a big decision very quickly. We should probably make sure we can stand each other's company before we complicate things further." The relief Catherine felt was mixed with something that might have been disappointment, though she wasn't ready to examine that feeling too closely. "That's very considerate of you." "It's practical," Jake said. "Marriage is hard enough when two people know each other well. Starting as strangers means we need to take our time, build trust, figure out how to live together without driving each other crazy." As the evening progressed, Catherine discovered that Jake Sullivan was a man of unexpected depths. He was well-read, with shelves of books that ranged from agricultural manuals to poetry. He could cook a decent meal, though he readily admitted that his culinary skills were limited to the basics. Most importantly, he was easy to talk with, asking questions about her life, sharing stories of his own, treating her like someone whose opinions mattered. "What made you want to leave Missouri?" Jake asked as they sat on the front porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering how much of her history to share. "My brother died 2 years ago. Consumption, after a long illness. I'd been caring for him since our parents passed when I was 18. When he died, I realized I'd spent nearly 30 years of my life taking care of other people and had nothing to show for it except an empty house and no prospects. So you decided to start over. I decided to try for something more than just survival, Catherine said. I'd saved a little money over the years, enough to travel and start fresh somewhere. I thought maybe at 45 I could still build a life that felt like more than just going through the motions. Jake nodded thoughtfully. What did you do before? I mean, how did you support yourself and your brother? I took in sewing and washing, kept a garden, raised chickens. After he died, I worked as a cook at hotels in 3 different towns before I saved enough to travel to Texas. Catherine glanced at him. What about you? Have you always been alone out here? Not always. Had a business partner for the first few years, but he decided ranch life wasn't for him and sold me his share. Been on my own since then, mostly by choice. By choice? Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening prairie. I was engaged once, about 10 years ago. Girl from back east who came out to visit her cousin. Pretty, young, full of romantic notions about frontier life. Catherine waited, sensing there was more to the story. She lasted 6 months, Jake continued. Turned out that the reality of ranch life didn't match her fantasies. The isolation, the hard work, the long stretches without society or entertainment. It wasn't what she'd signed up for. She went back east and married a banker. I'm sorry. I'm not, Jake said, surprising her. It taught me something important about the difference between someone who wants the idea of a thing and someone who wants the thing itself. She wanted the idea of being married to a rugged cowboy. She didn't want the actual life that came with it. He turned to look at Catherine directly. That's part of why I spoke up today. You weren't looking for romance or adventure or some fantasy version of frontier life. You were looking for partnership, respect, a chance to build something real. That tells me you understand the difference between dreams and reality. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Catherine with its naturalness. She woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, finding genuine pleasure in cooking for someone who appreciated good food. Jake was up even earlier, tending to the animals and checking the fences, but he always returned to the house as she was setting the table, and they would eat together in companionable conversation. The household tasks fell naturally into a division that felt fair rather than imposed. Catherine took over the cooking, cleaning, and mending, while Jake handled the outdoor work. But the boundaries weren't rigid. She often helped with easier ranch chores, and he never hesitated to assist with heavy lifting or repairs around the house. You're handy with that hammer, Jake observed one afternoon, watching Catherine repair a loose board on the front porch. My father was a blacksmith, Catherine explained, positioning another nail with practiced precision. He taught me that it was foolish to wait for someone else to fix what you could repair yourself. Smart man. What happened to him? Kicked by a horse when I was 16, died 3 days later. Catherine drove the nail home with 3 sure strokes. That's when I started taking care of my brother full time. He was already showing signs of the consumption, though we didn't know what it was then. Jake leaned against the porch railing, watching her work. That's when you gave up your own plans. I didn't have any plans, Catherine said, testing the repaired board with her weight. 16-year-old girls in small Missouri towns didn't have many options. I could have married young, I suppose, but there wasn't anyone I wanted to marry, and my brother needed care. Never regretted it. Catherine considered the question seriously. Sometimes, especially when I'd see other women my age with their families, their established lives. But regret's a luxury I couldn't afford. The work needed doing, and I was the one to do it. Their conversations often took this form. Casual exchanges that revealed pieces of their histories, their thoughts, their gradual understanding of each other. Catherine learned that Jake was intelligent and well-educated, having attended college in St. Louis before deciding that ranch life suited him better than city business. He'd bought the land with money inherited from his grandfather and had built his success through hard work and careful planning. Why ranching? Catherine asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear. Freedom, Jake said simply, and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. I like working with animals, like being outdoors, like the rhythm of seasons. Most of all, I like being my own boss. Catherine nodded, understanding more than he'd actually said. She'd spent so many years at the mercy of other people's needs and expectations that the idea of being truly independent held powerful appeal. The physical aspect of their marriage remained carefully undefined. Jake had moved his belongings to the smaller downstairs bedroom and treated Catherine with the kind of respectful courtesy he might show an honored guest. They shared meals and conversation, worked side by side on ranch tasks, but maintained the careful distance of people still learning to trust each other. It was Catherine who first began to feel the constraints of their polite arrangement. 3 weeks into their marriage, while hanging laundry on the line behind the house, she found herself watching Jake work with the horses in the corral. He moved with an easy grace that spoke of years of experience, his voice low and soothing as he worked with a young colt that was still learning to accept human handling. There was something about the patience he showed with the animals, the quiet authority he exercised without force or cruelty, that made Catherine see him in a new light. This was a man who understood that trust had to be earned, that partnership was built on respect rather than dominance. That evening, as they worked together in the kitchen, Catherine preparing supper while Jake repaired a broken cabinet door, she found herself studying his hands. They were large and capable, scarred from years of hard work, but surprisingly gentle in their movements. "Jake," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of what she was about to ask. "Yes? Are you, that is, are you satisfied with our arrangement, the way things are between us?" Jake paused in his work, his attention focusing completely on her. "What do you mean?" Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to continue. "I mean, we're married, but we're living like business partners, polite strangers sharing a house. Is that what you want? Is that enough for you?" Jake set down his tools and turned to face her fully. "Catherine, I told you we'd take things at your pace. I meant that. But what if my pace is too slow? What if I'm being foolish, holding back because I'm afraid of not being what you expect?" "What I expect," Jake said quietly, "is for you to feel safe here, to know that you can trust me not to push for more than you're ready to give." Catherine took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she needed to say. "What if I'm ready for more? What if I want to be your wife in every sense, not just on paper?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Jake's eyes searched her face, as if looking for signs that she was speaking from obligation rather than genuine desire. "Catherine," he said finally, "are you sure? Because once we cross that line, there's no going back to polite strangers." "I don't want to go back," Catherine said firmly. "I want to go forward. I want to build something real with you, not just a convenient arrangement." Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing lightly over her cheekbones. "Then we go forward," he said softly. "Together." When he kissed her, it was with the same patience and gentleness he showed to everything he cared about. There was no desperation or hunger, just a quiet certainty that made Catherine feel cherished rather than desired. That night, for the first time in her 45 years, Catherine Winters Sullivan learned what it meant to be loved by a man who saw her as precious rather than convenient. Jake's touch was reverent, his attention focused completely on her pleasure and comfort. He made love to her like she was something rare and valuable, something worth savoring. "Are you all right?" he asked afterward, as they lay together in the darkness of their shared bedroom. "Better than all right," Catherine whispered, marveling at the truth of it. "I never knew. I didn't understand what I was missing." Jake's arm tightened around her. "Neither did I," he said quietly. "Neither did I." The first challenge to their happiness came from an unexpected source: prosperity itself. Word of Jake's marriage had spread through the surrounding ranches and towns, carried by the usual network of gossip and speculation that connected frontier communities. But it wasn't the scandal of their sudden wedding that brought trouble to their door. It was the realization that Catherine Sullivan was exactly what she appeared to be: an intelligent, capable woman who was making an already successful ranch even more profitable. "You've turned into quite the businesswoman," Jake observed one morning in October as they reviewed their finances over breakfast. The numbers told a story that would have seemed impossible just 4 months earlier. Their vegetable garden had produced surplus crops that commanded premium prices in town. Catherine's careful household management had cut their expenses significantly, and her suggestions for improving their cattle breeding program were already showing results. "I've always been good with numbers," Catherine said, pleased but trying not to show it too obviously. "And I understand the value of hard work. Everything else is just common sense." What Catherine was too modest to say was that she'd thrown herself into making the ranch successful with the same focused determination she'd once applied to caring for her brother. But this time, instead of thankless duty, she was building something for herself and Jake together. The results were visible in everything from the expansion of their vegetable garden to the improved condition of their cattle to the growing balance in their bank account. The town of Millbrook had begun to take notice. Where once Catherine had been the object of pity or scorn, she was now grudgingly respected as Mrs. Jake Sullivan, the woman who'd helped make the Sullivan Ranch one of the most prosperous spreads in the county. "Heard tell your new wife's got quite a head for business," Sheriff Bradley mentioned to Jake during one of his monthly trips to town. "Word is, she's turned your place into a real operation." "She's got good instincts," Jake replied carefully, not wanting to invite more curiosity than necessary. But it was precisely this success that drew the attention they'd hoped to avoid. Henry Lawson, who had spent the months since Catherine's wedding watching his own modest general store struggle with increasing competition from larger establishments in neighboring towns, began to view the Sullivan Ranch's prosperity with growing resentment. "It's not natural," he complained to anyone who would listen. "A woman her age shouldn't be making decisions about cattle breeding and crop rotation. Sullivan's let her get above herself, and it's going to bring trouble to the whole county." The complaint might have remained mere gossip if it hadn't found an audience in Marcus Brennan, Jake's former business partner, who had sold his share of the ranch 8 years earlier. Marcus had moved to Dallas and built a successful freight business, but he'd never quite gotten over what he saw as Jake's betrayal in buying him out when he'd wanted to expand the ranch in directions Jake thought unwise. When Marcus learned through business associates that the Sullivan Ranch was not only thriving, but was being managed in part by a woman, he saw an opportunity to settle old scores. "You know," Marcus said to Henry over drinks in the Millbrook saloon, "there might be legal issues with allowing a woman to make business decisions that affect property values in the area. I mean, if she's actually signing contracts or making financial commitments without proper male oversight." It was a vicious suggestion designed to exploit the legal vulnerabilities that women faced in business dealings. While Catherine had been careful to ensure that all official documents bore Jake's signature, she had indeed been the driving force behind many of their business relationships and had occasionally acted as Jake's representative in negotiations. The attack, when it came, was subtle and devastating in its precision. Catherine was in town purchasing supplies when she encountered Mrs. Abernathy outside the general store. The banker's wife had maintained a cool politeness toward Catherine since the wedding, neither openly hostile nor particularly welcoming. "Mrs. Sullivan," Mrs. Abernathy said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "how nice to see you. I was just speaking with Mr. Harrison about your business activities." Mr. Harrison was the president of Millbrook's only bank, a man whose approval could make or break any business venture in the county. Catherine felt a chill of apprehension. "What kind of business activities?" Catherine asked carefully. "Well, there's been some concern about the contracts you've been negotiating on behalf of your husband. Some people are questioning whether those agreements are legally binding, given that a woman can't legally enter into business contracts without her husband's explicit consent for each transaction." The implication was clear. Catherine's role in managing the ranch's business affairs could potentially invalidate their agreements, leaving them vulnerable to financial ruin. "I see," Catherine said, keeping her voice level despite the fury building inside her. "And who exactly has raised these concerns?" "Oh, I couldn't say," Mrs. Abernathy replied with false innocence. "But you might want to speak with your husband about ensuring that all your arrangements are properly documented." That evening, Catherine told Jake about the encounter. His reaction was swift and angry. "Brennan," he said immediately, "this has his fingerprints all over it. He's still bitter about the partnership, and he's found a way to use the law against us. Can they actually invalidate our contracts?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jake's expression was grim. Possibly. Depends on how far they want to push it and how much money they're willing to spend on lawyers. Even if they can't win, they can tie us up in legal proceedings long enough to ruin us financially. The campaign against them was insidious in its effectiveness. Business associates who had been eager to work with the successful Sullivan Ranch suddenly became uncertain about the validity of their agreements. Suppliers began demanding cash payments rather than extending credit. Most devastatingly, their largest customer, a cattle buyer from San Antonio who had been purchasing their stock for premium prices, canceled his standing order, citing concerns about irregular business practices. "They're trying to isolate us," Jake said after a particularly frustrating day of watching longtime business relationships dissolve into mistrust and legal concerns. "Make it impossible for us to operate until we're forced to sell." Catherine felt the familiar burn of injustice that had accompanied so many of life's disappointments, but this time it was mixed with something new. Rage. She had found a life worth fighting for, and she wasn't going to let small-minded people destroy it without a battle. "What if I step back?" she suggested, though the words tasted like ashes. "What if I stopped being involved in the business side of things? Just focused on the household tasks?" Jake's reaction was immediate and fierce. "Absolutely not. You're the reason this ranch is as successful as it is. I'm not going to let them force you back into some corner where your intelligence and capabilities don't matter." "But if it saves the ranch?" "It won't save anything," Jake interrupted. "It'll just prove to them that they can intimidate us into giving up what's ours. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've got a better idea." The solution Jake proposed was characteristically direct. They would make their partnership not just legal, but unassailable. "I want to put the ranch in both our names," he told Catherine the next morning. "Full partnership, equal ownership, every document signed by both of us. Let them try to argue that you don't have the right to make business decisions about property you own." Catherine stared at him in shock. "Jake, you can't be serious. This ranch is your life's work. You built it from nothing. And you've made it better than I ever could have alone," Jake replied firmly. "This isn't charity, Catherine. This is recognition of what you've contributed and what you're worth as a partner. But if something happens to our marriage—" "Nothing's going to happen to our marriage," Jake said with quiet certainty. "But even if it did, you deserve half of everything we've built together." The legal paperwork took 3 weeks to complete, requiring trips to the county seat and consultations with lawyers who were initially skeptical about the arrangement. But Jake's determination was absolute, and Catherine's obvious competence in discussing the technical aspects of ranch management eventually convinced even the most conservative legal minds that this was a legitimate business partnership. The day they signed the papers, Catherine felt a shift in how she saw herself. She was no longer someone who'd been rescued from spinsterhood by a kind man's charity. She was Catherine Sullivan, co-owner of one of the most successful ranches in the county. A woman whose business acumen and hard work had earned her a place at the table where decisions were made. The effect on their opponents was immediate and devastating. Marcus Brennan's carefully constructed legal challenge crumbled when faced with documents that gave Catherine undeniable rights to make decisions about property she legally owned. Henry Lawson's complaints about women overstepping their bounds rang hollow when the woman in question was acting within her clear legal authority. But the victory came at a cost. The sustained attack on their livelihood had taken a toll on both of them, and the strain of fighting for their right to exist as equals had exposed some of the fault lines in their still developing relationship. "I'm sorry," Catherine said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I'm sorry that marrying me brought all this trouble to your door." Jake turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Catherine, do you think I regret marrying you?" "Sometimes I wonder if you should," she replied honestly. "Your life was simpler before, quieter." "My life was empty before," Jake said firmly. "Successful maybe, but empty. You didn't bring trouble to my door. You brought purpose, partnership, and the kind of happiness I'd stopped believing was possible." He reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band she'd worn since their wedding day. "Besides, if they hadn't attacked us, I might never have realized that what we have is worth fighting for. Not just the ranch, Not just the business, but this. United States. The life we're building together. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. I love you, she said, the words coming easier now than they had in those first tentative months. I love you too, Jake replied. And I'm proud of you. The way you handled all this. The way you stood up for yourself and for us. It proves everything I believed about you from that first day on the church steps. As autumn deepened into winter, the Sullivan Ranch settled into a new rhythm. Their business relationships had been reestablished on firmer ground, their legal position was unassailable, and their partnership had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger. But most importantly, Catherine had discovered something she'd never expected to find at 45. Not just love, but respect. Not just security, but recognition. Not just a place to belong, but a voice that mattered. Do you ever miss it? Jake asked one evening as they worked together in the kitchen, Catherine preparing bread while Jake repaired harness by lamplight. Miss what? The simplicity of before. When you didn't have to worry about business rivals and legal challenges and all the complications that come with success. Catherine considered the question while kneading dough, her hands working in the steady rhythm she'd learned from her mother decades earlier. No, she said finally. I don't miss being invisible. I don't miss having my opinions dismissed or my contributions overlooked. I'd rather fight for the right to be heard than live quietly in the shadows. Jake smiled, his weathered face creasing with affection and admiration. That's my Catherine, he said softly, never content to settle for less than she deserves. Outside, winter wind rattled the windows and reminded them of the harsh realities of frontier life. But inside their warm kitchen, working side by side on the mundane tasks that made up their daily life, Catherine and Jake Sullivan had found something that no amount of external hostility could destroy. A partnership built on mutual respect, tested by adversity, and strengthened by the knowledge that they were stronger together than either of them had ever been alone. By the spring of 1888, nearly a year after their unconventional wedding, the Sullivan Ranch had become something of a legend in the county. Visitors came from as far as Dallas to see the operation that was being run, in part by a woman, and to witness firsthand the success that had resulted from such an unusual partnership. Catherine stood on the front porch, watching as a delegation from the Texas Cattle Raisers Association examined their prize bulls with the serious attention of men who understood the value of superior breeding stock. At 46, she had grown into her role as co-owner with a confidence that seemed to surprise everyone except Jake. Mrs. Sullivan, called James Morton, the association's president, could you join us for a moment? 6 months earlier, such a request would have sent Catherine's heart racing with anxiety. Now she simply smoothed her hands on her apron and walked toward the group with the calm assurance of someone who knew her business. What can I tell you, gentlemen? We're interested in your breeding program, Morton said, consulting a leather-bound notebook. The records show remarkable improvement in your stock over the past year. We'd like to understand your methodology. Catherine launched into an explanation of the selective breeding techniques she'd researched and implemented, discussing bloodlines and genetic characteristics with the fluency of someone who'd studied the subject extensively. The men listened with the respectful attention they might give to any expert, asking technical questions and taking notes. It was a far cry from the woman who'd stood on church steps a year ago, being dismissed as too old to matter. Remarkable, Morton murmured when she'd finished. You've achieved results that some ranchers work decades to accomplish. Education and hard work, Catherine replied simply, and the freedom to implement ideas without having to convince someone else that a woman might know what she's talking about. The slight challenge in her tone wasn't lost on the assembled men, but rather than taking offense, several of them smiled appreciatively. Indeed, Morton said, the association would like to invite you to speak at our annual conference this fall. Your techniques could benefit ranchers throughout the state. Catherine felt a thrill of excitement that had nothing to do with the business opportunity and everything to do with recognition. I'd be honored. That evening, as they celebrated the day's success over a dinner of Catherine's famous pot roast, Jake raised his glass in a toast. To my partner, he said, his eyes warm with affection and pride, Who's proven that the best business decisions come from combining intelligence with experience, regardless of what form that intelligence comes in? Catherine blushed but didn't deflect the compliment as she once would have. She learned to accept praise as well as criticism, to own her successes as well as acknowledge her failures. To us, she corrected, we've built this together. It was true. Over the months, their marriage had evolved from a practical arrangement into something neither of them had expected, a true partnership in every sense of the word. They made decisions together, shared work according to their individual strengths, and had learned to navigate disagreements with the respect and consideration that came from genuinely valuing each other's opinions. The romantic love had grown more slowly, but it had grown. Catherine had discovered that passion didn't have to be the wild, consuming fire she'd read about in novels. It could be something steadier and more sustaining. The warmth of being truly known and accepted. The security of being valued for exactly who she was. The quiet excitement of building something meaningful with someone who saw her as an equal. "I've been thinking," Jake said as they settled onto the porch swing for their customary evening conversation, "about expanding again. More cattle? More everything. Land, cattle, maybe even some of those new agricultural techniques you've been reading about. But most importantly," he paused, his expression growing serious, "I think it's time we started thinking about what comes next." Catherine felt a flutter of uncertainty. "What do you mean?" "I mean legacy. What happens to all this when we're gone? We've built something worth preserving, Catherine. Something that could benefit other people for generations." The conversation that followed was one they'd been avoiding for months, dancing around the edge of a topic that was both practical and deeply personal. They had no children and at their ages were unlikely to have any. The question of what would happen to their ranch, their success, their life's work, was one that required careful consideration. "We could sell it eventually," Catherine said quietly. "Use the money to support ourselves in our old age." "We could," Jake agreed. "Or we could do something different, something that might matter more." He told her about an idea that had been growing in his mind for months, the possibility of establishing their ranch as a training ground for other women who wanted to learn about agriculture and business. A place where women could come to gain the skills and confidence needed to manage their own properties or businesses. "Like a school?" Catherine asked, intrigued. "More like an apprenticeship program. Women could come for a season or a year, learn everything from cattle breeding to crop rotation to business management. They'd work alongside us, contribute to the ranch's success, and leave with practical skills that could change their lives." The idea was revolutionary, potentially scandalous, and absolutely compelling. Catherine could imagine the young widows, the spinster daughters of failed farmers, the women trapped in marriages to men who didn't value their intelligence, all of them coming to the Sullivan Ranch to learn that there were other ways to live, other possibilities for women who were willing to work for them. "It would be controversial," Catherine said thoughtfully. "Everything worthwhile is controversial at first," Jake replied, "but we've proven that unconventional approaches can work. Maybe it's time to help other women prove the same thing." The conversation continued long into the night, and by morning they'd made a decision that would change not just their own lives, but the lives of dozens of women who would come after them. The Sullivan Ranch School for Women in Agriculture would accept its first students in the fall of 1889. The first newspaper article about the Sullivan Ranch School appeared in the Dallas Morning News in September 1889, complete with a photograph of Catherine standing beside their prize bull and a headline that read, "Texas woman proves age no barrier to success in ranching." Mrs. Catherine Sullivan, 47, has become one of the most successful ranchers in East Texas through a combination of scientific breeding techniques and sound business practices. Now she and her husband Jake plan to share their knowledge with other women through an innovative education program that challenges traditional assumptions about women's capabilities in agriculture. The article was reprinted in newspapers across Texas and several other states, generating a flood of correspondence from women who wanted to know more about the program. Some letters came from young widows struggling to manage inherited property, others from spinster daughters of farmers who wanted to learn skills that might make them independent. A few came from wives of failed ranchers who hoped to gain the knowledge needed to help save their families' livelihoods. Listen to this one. Catherine said, reading from a letter postmarked in Kansas. Dear Mrs. Sullivan, I am 28 years old and have been managing my late husband's farm for 2 years since he died in a horse accident. The bank wants to foreclose because they say a woman can't run a farming operation profitably. I've heard about your school and wonder if you might be able to teach me enough to prove them wrong. Jake looked up from his own stack of correspondence. How many applications do we have now? 47, Catherine replied, still amazed by the response. For 12 positions. They'd decided to start small, taking just a dozen women for their first year. The students would live in a bunkhouse Jake was constructing near the main house, work alongside Catherine and Jake in all aspects of ranch management, and attend evening classes on topics ranging from animal husbandry to bookkeeping. The selection process was more difficult than either of them had anticipated. Each application told a story of struggle, determination, and hope that reminded Catherine of her own journey. We'll take this one, Catherine said, setting aside a letter from a 34-year-old woman whose husband had abandoned her and their 2 children on a failing homestead in Oklahoma. And this one? The second letter was from a 19-year-old whose family had lost their farm to drought and was hoping to gain skills that might help them start over. By October, they'd selected their first class, 12 women ranging in age from 19 to 53, representing circumstances from newly widowed to never married, from barely literate to well-educated. What they all shared was determination and a willingness to work harder than most people thought women should have to work. The program was an immediate success, though not without its challenges. Some of the women had never been away from home before and struggled with homesickness. Others chafed at the structured routine or found the physical demands more taxing than they'd expected. But most threw themselves into the work with an enthusiasm that reminded Catherine of her own transformation from reluctant spinster to confident businesswoman. You're different than I expected, said Mary Patterson, a 25-year-old widow from Arkansas, during one of their evening discussions. When I heard about a woman who was successfully running a ranch, I pictured someone harder, tougher, more like a man. Catherine smiled, understanding the observation. And what do you think now? I think you're exactly what a successful woman looks like, Mary replied. Strong without being hard, confident without being arrogant, intelligent without being intimidating. You make it seem possible. It was exactly the kind of impact Catherine had hoped to have. She remembered her own struggles with self-doubt, her years of believing that her age and circumstances made her somehow less valuable than other women. If she could help even a few women avoid that kind of diminished thinking, the program would be worthwhile. The success of the school brought both fame and criticism. Articles about the Sullivan experiment appeared in newspapers and magazines across the country, some praising their innovative approach to women's education and others condemning it as a dangerous departure from traditional values. Women Teaching Women to Compete with Men, read one particularly vitriolic editorial in a Chicago paper. The Sullivan Ranch represents everything that's wrong with modern society's confused ideas about gender roles and natural law. But for every criticism, there were 2 or 3 letters of support, many from women who wished such an opportunity had been available to them in their youth. The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source, the Texas state legislature, which in 1891 passed a resolution commending Catherine and Jake Sullivan for their innovative contributions to agricultural education and their pioneering work in expanding opportunities for women in business. Catherine was invited to speak at the state capitol, an honor that would have seemed impossible to the woman who'd been rejected on church steps 4 years earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, Catherine began her address to the packed legislative chamber. I stand before you today not as an exception to what women can accomplish, but as an example of what becomes possible when women are given the opportunity to prove their worth. She spoke for 20 minutes about the success of their school, the achievements of their graduates, and the economic benefits that resulted when women were allowed to contribute their full capabilities to their communities. The response was enthusiastic, with standing ovations and requests for copies of her remarks to be distributed throughout the state. But the moment that meant the most to Catherine came after the formal ceremony, when a young woman approached her in the Capitol hallway. Mrs. Sullivan, the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion, my name is Sarah McKinley. I graduated from your program 2 years ago. Catherine remembered her immediately, a shy 22-year-old who'd arrived at the ranch with little confidence and even less hope. "Sarah, how wonderful to see you. How are you doing?" "I wanted to thank you," Sarah continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Because of what you taught me, I was able to save my family's farm. We're not just surviving now, we're thriving. And last month, I was elected to the school board in our county, the first woman ever to hold that position." Catherine felt her own eyes fill with tears. "I'm so proud of you. You saved my life," Sarah said simply. "You showed me that being a woman wasn't a limitation. It was just a different way of being strong." That evening, as Catherine and Jake sat on the train heading back to their ranch, she reflected on how far they'd both come from that morning on the church steps in Millbrook. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Henry Lawson hadn't rejected me?" Catherine asked. Jake considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but I think you would have been miserable with him. He would have seen you as adequate instead of remarkable. You might have had security, but you never would have discovered what you were truly capable of." Catherine nodded, understanding the truth of his words. "I used to think that being chosen was the most important thing. Now I realize that being valued is what really matters." "And you are valued," Jake said, taking her hand, "by me, by our students, by everyone whose life you've touched. You've proven that worth isn't measured by age or by other people's narrow definitions of what women should be." As their train rolled through the Texas countryside toward home, Catherine marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. At 50, she was more successful, more respected, and more fulfilled than she'd ever imagined possible. She'd built a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, created a business that challenged conventional wisdom about women's capabilities, and established a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. The Sullivan Ranch School would operate for 15 more years, graduating over 200 women who went on to become successful farmers, business owners, teachers, and community leaders across the American West. Many of them would credit Catherine Sullivan with showing them that their age, their gender, or their circumstances didn't have to define their possibilities. But Catherine's greatest achievement wasn't professional, it was personal. She'd learned to see herself as valuable not because someone else chose her, but because she'd chosen to recognize her own worth. She discovered that love didn't have an expiration date, that it was never too late to build something meaningful, and that sometimes the best things in life came to those who'd learned the difference between settling and thriving. "Jake," Catherine said as their ranch came into view in the distance, lights glowing warmly in the windows of their home. "Do you know what I'm most grateful for?" "What's that?" "That I was 45 when we met," Catherine said with a smile. "Because if I'd been younger, I might not have had the wisdom to recognize what real love looked like. I might have settled for someone who saw me as convenient instead of precious." Jake squeezed her hand. "And I'm grateful that I was smart enough to speak up that day. Otherwise, I might have spent the rest of my life wondering what I'd missed." As they pulled into their yard, Catherine could see lights in the bunkhouse, where their current class of students was probably gathered for their evening study session. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new women to teach, new barriers to break down. But tonight, there was just the quiet satisfaction of work well done and love well earned. Catherine Sullivan, the woman who'd been told she was too old to marry, had proven that sometimes the most extraordinary lives began exactly when the world expected them to end. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of Catherine Winters Sullivan's remarkable journey. From rejected spinster to respected rancher. From woman dismissed as past her usefulness to pioneer who changed how an entire state thought about what women could accomplish. But Catherine's story isn't just about the past. It's about the eternal truth that worth isn't determined by age, by other people's expectations, or by society's narrow definitions of when a woman's value expires. Catherine proved that 45 wasn't too old to start over, wasn't too late to find love, and wasn't past the point where dreams could still come true. Her marriage to Jake Sullivan lasted 37 years, until his death in 1924. Catherine continued to run their ranch and school until she was 73, when she finally retired to write her memoirs. She died in 1932 at the age of 90, surrounded by dozens of women whose lives she'd changed, and children who called her grandmother, though she'd never given birth to any of them. The Sullivan Ranch School graduated over 200 women who went on to become teachers, business owners, politicians, and pioneers in their own right. Many credited Catherine with showing them that their potential wasn't limited by their gender, their age, or the circumstances of their birth. But perhaps Catherine's greatest legacy was the simple truth she lived every day. That real love, the kind that transforms lives and builds lasting partnerships, isn't about youth or beauty or conventional timing. It's about recognition, respect, and the courage to see value where others see only problems. In our modern world, we still face the same prejudices that Catherine confronted. Women are still told they're too old, too experienced, too set in their ways. They're still encouraged to lower their expectations, to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they can get, to believe that their best years are behind them. Catherine Sullivan's story is a powerful reminder that none of that is true. It's never too late to start over, never too old to be valued, never past the point where extraordinary things can happen. What about you? Have you ever been told you were too old, too late, too much of something, or not enough of something else? Have you ever felt like the world had written you off because you didn't fit its narrow definitions of what makes a person valuable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the times you've chosen courage over comfort, the moments when you've refused to accept other people's limitations on your possibilities, the instances when you've discovered that your real life was just beginning when everyone else thought it was ending. If this story of late-blooming love and hard-won respect moved you, if it reminded you that worth isn't measured by the calendar but by character, show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement tells us that these stories matter, that the lessons of the frontier still have relevance in our modern world. Subscribe to Wild West Stories and become part of our community of people who believe that courage, determination, and the willingness to fight for what you deserve never go out of style. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest tales from the American frontier, where ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges and proved time and again that it's never too late to write a new chapter of your life. Remember, Catherine Sullivan was 45 when Jake saw her real worth, 50 when she became a respected businesswoman, and 60 when she was invited to speak at the state capitol. Your age isn't a limitation. It's a testament to your survival, your wisdom, and your refusal to give up on yourself. Until next time, remember that the frontier spirit lives on in everyone who chooses to see possibility instead of problems, who values character over convention, and who believes that the best love stories are the ones that begin when the world least expects them. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the wild heart of America, where legends were born not just from gunfights and gold strikes, but from the quiet heroism of people who refused to accept that their dreams had expiration dates. We'll see you on the next trail, where more stories of courage, love, and second chances are waiting to be told.